Hey everybody, my name's Tim, and we're doing Aquinas' Quinque Viae, which is Latin for five ways. Typically in religion programs you hear it called Quinque Viae, and in philosophy programs hear it called five ways. I'm not really sure why, I don't think it matters a whole lot, but I figured I would introduce both terms just in case. First of all, who is Aquinas? Well, his name's Thomas Aquinas, or Saint Thomas. Aquinas is actually the name of the city that he's from, Aquina, or Aquino. So his name was Thomas, but he's a 13th century Roman Catholic philosopher and theologian. He's also often regarded as the Catholic Aristotle, or he's typically said to have baptized Aristotle. Basically, he likes his Aristotle. He's also the writer of Summa Theologica, which is an insanely long systematic theology book, which answers 615 different theological questions in a very wordy way. Alright, so I'd be remiss if I talked about Aquinas and didn't bring up some of the fun stuff about him. First of all, he had a nickname to kind of set the story for who he was, as the Dumb Ox. He was rather large, he was actually very large, he was rather quiet, and typically seemed oafish and just dim-witted, to be frank. And so he actually got nicknamed the Dumb Ox, not ironically, but rather rudely, but the name kind of stuck, I suppose, and so that is nice, I suppose. So there's two interesting stories about Aquinas. One, he had a supposed weird interaction with a cross in church one day, and thought, or I guess he did, I suppose, I don't know, speak with God in some weird way, and a lot of these details are different and hard to describe because the story accounts are separate and different, but the story is told that after this he decided that everything that he had known, everything he had written, including Summa Theologica, which is his insanely long book, was all worthless to him. He says that it is all compared to straw to him at this point, and that all of his writing and all of his work, compared to what he now knew and understood and the experience, was all not worth his time anymore. And so he stopped writing, and that was near the end of his life, because he had got called to Rome to speak with the Pope, not specifically about the writing thing, but just because he was a prominent theologian. And on his way there, shortly after this experience, there was a fallen tree, and he was riding on the back of a donkey, and he hit his head on the tree and fell to the ground. That turned into infection and sickness, and ultimately he died. And so, moral of the story, if you're riding a donkey, watch out for low-hanging branches. But so, Aquinas' five ways. These are five separate but not independent proofs for the existence of God. What I mean by that is that they should all be taken as one large movement of thought, I suppose is a way to say it. And especially a lot of modern scholars on Aquinas believe that while they don't necessarily rely on each other, they find their strength in all five of them together being one unit of thought. We'll get on to what the actual intention of these was later on in this presentation. We're going to talk about what Anthony Kenny thinks about Aquinas, which is probably different than a lot of the Aquinas you've heard and talked about, and so we can actually set that up as perhaps a comparison that might be fruitful to explore. But the five ways are the unmoved mover, the first cause, the argument from contingency, the argument from degree, and the teleological argument. So, the argument of the unmoved mover. This argument, or ex muto, unmoved mover, tries to explain that God must be the cause of motion in the universe, is therefore a form of the cosmological argument. It employs Aristotle, of course, Aristotle's dichotomy of potentiality and actuality. The argument follows that 1. Some things are in motion. 2. A thing cannot move itself, as it requires a mover. 3. An infinite regression of movers is impossible. 4. Therefore, there is an unmoved mover from whom all motion proceeds. 5. This mover is what we call God. It's noteworthy that throughout Aristotle and Aquinas, motion has a much wider meaning than what we mean by motion, and so perhaps we shouldn't even use that word. But perhaps a better synonym would be change, because it not only refers to the movement of positions in space, but it also thinks of things such as movement growth and of change and things like that. The second argument, the argument of the first cause, is of course similar to the argument of the first mover. It tries, unlike the argument of the first mover, to prove that God exists from causes instead of from movements. Therefore, obviously, like the first mover argument, it's going to be another cosmological argument. It goes, 1, some things are caused. 2, everything that is caused by something else. 3, an progression of causation is impossible. 4, therefore there must be an uncaused cause of all that is caused. 5, this cause is what we call God. The argument from contingency breaks apart from the other two arguments, but is once again a cosmological argument. 1, many things in the universe must either exist or not exist, and all things are finite. These things are called contingent beings. 2, it is impossible for everything in the universe to be contingent, for then there would be nothing existing. So nothing would exist now, since there is nothing to bring anything into existence. And that statement is clearly false because things do exist. 3, therefore there must be a necessary being whose existence is not contingent on any other beings. This is whom we call God. 4. Argument 4, the argument from degree or gradation is heavily based on the teaching of Aristotle, maybe more so than the other 4. It goes as such. Varying perfections of degrees may be found throughout the universe. These degrees assume the existence of an ultimate standard of perfection. Therefore, perfection must have a pinnacle. This pinnacle is whom we call God. The final of Aquinas' 5 ways is the teleological argument. The teleological argument, or argument from design, which claims that many things in the universe possess final causes that must be directed by God. For instance, all natural bodies in the world act towards an end. These objects are in themselves unintelligent. For instance, planets, plants. Both of these things would be instances of, especially for someone in this time, planets are moving in a certain direction, they're moving in a certain way, and that is caused by a design. Incidentally, they believe that that design was a circle because that was a more natural shape, I suppose. And plants, likewise, they grow in a certain way, but they do not grow on their own intelligence and by their own thought. They instead grow in some other way, which brings premise 3, acting towards an end is a characteristic of intelligence. Therefore, there exists an intelligent being that guides all natural bodies toward their ends. 5, this is whom we call God. There's an alternate interpretation depending on which scholar is reading this argument, and that argument, the teleological argument, or the argument from design, claims that everything in the universe follows from laws which must have been created by God. And so this is, of course, a similar argument, but all natural bodies follow laws of conduct. These objects are themselves unintelligent. Laws of conduct are characteristics of intelligence. Therefore, there exists an intelligent being that created the laws of all natural bodies. This is whom we call God. Finally, what I wanted to mention at the end was some recent work done by a guy named Anthony Kenny, who is a well-known philosopher, and especially historical philosophy. What he wants to argue, and is what is currently of debate right now, is instead of considering these 5 ways as arguments for the existence of God, Kenny wants us to think of these 5 ways as being arguments for why theology should be a science. And it goes as such. Aquinas, who loved Aristotle, wanted theology, and specifically the study of divine scripture or sacred scripture. He wanted that study to be considered what Aristotle would call a science. And for that to be the case, there needs to exist a thing for the science to study. And so if Aquinas were capable of proving that God existed in some substantial way, then he could prove that sacred theology was a science, and then Aristotle would like him more, I guess, is the way of putting it best. And so he wants to secure these things through these 5 different arguments. And so that, I think, is just conceptually a different type of argument than one that would be done trying to proselytize other people to believe in a certain religion. And so Kenny wants us to, with that consideration in mind, look at these arguments in new light. That one, he is not arguing against people who are atheistic because the majority of the world at this point, at least the world that they knew of and interacted with, was largely Christian. And so, and by largely I mean borderline exclusively. And so he wouldn't necessarily be arguing to try and convince people of the truth of his argument. Instead, he just wanted to posit an argument that proved it existed, in the same way that a scientist would want to put arguments, for instance, Newton would want to make an argument that proved gravity existed. He wasn't trying to convince people that gravity existed. It was all kind of obvious, but he wanted to secure it in a provable fashion, thereas to be able to build upon it scientifically. And so with that in mind, that is my discussion on Thomas Aquinas' 5 ways. Thank you for listening.